Jesus was still in diapers when his parents brought him to the temple in Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as the custom was, and offer a sacrifice. And that's when old Simeon spotted him. Years before, he'd been told he wouldn't die before he'd seen the Messiah with his own two eyes. And time was running out. When the moment finally came, one look through his cloudy eyes was all it took. He asked if it would be all right to hold the baby in his arms, and they told him to go ahead, but be careful not to drop him. The old man, full of awe and wonder, the baby perhaps tugging at the fringes of his beard, said, "Lord, now your servant can depart in peace, according to your word, for mine eyes have seen your salvation." Well, the parents were pleased as punch, and so he blessed them too for good measure. But then, something about the mother stopped him, and his expression changed. What he saw in her face was a long way off. But what was there so plainly, he couldn't pretend. This child, Simeon said, is destined to the falling and the rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed. And a sword shall pierce your own soul too, Mary. He would have bitten off his tongue, then said it, but in that holy place he felt he had no choice. Then he handed the baby back to Mary, and he departed in something less than the perfect peace he dreamed of through the long years of waiting. You know, I have always loved this story of Simeon, and this year is no exception. And not because of the fact that I can relate to this story so well, at least the waiting aspect of it. In fact, I often find that waiting is not one of my greatest virtues, and it's not even close. I don't even like to wait in a fast food line very long. So, how in the world does one wait a lifetime for hope of a better world? How can a person live through tragedy, war, and oppression without losing hope that there will one day be peace? And how can one wait for the vindication, for God's justice of all people, in fact, a whole nation, and still be hopeful while you wait? And how can a centuries-old promise of freedom for captives and those under the oppressive laws of the Roman Empire lend itself to the hope of an elderly man? And yet, how does one, perhaps me and maybe you too, wait in hope for something to change? You see, there's this hope that is already here with the coming of the Christ child. But there's this not yet kind of hope, the kind of hope we experience during Advent. And maybe, just maybe, we live into that hope all year long. So perhaps before the manger is put away and the tree is down and the cookies are consumed, it may be worth our while to revisit the story of Simeon and how he waited an entire lifetime for a promise to be fulfilled. And as soon as he gets a glimpse of what he had been waiting for, hoping for his whole life, As soon as he cradles the baby in his arm, he dies. Simeon's life comes to a close just as he holds the hope for a better tomorrow. And not just for him, not just for Israel, but for all people, Gentile and Jew alike. You know, it has always seemed so unfair to me that Simeon, this devout and righteous man, this steadfast old man, clinging to his Jewish heritage with aging eyes clouded over by cataracts and hands misshapen by arthritis, does not get to see the comprehensive fulfillment of God's gift come to its full fruition in his lifetime. But guess what? Neither do we. You see, we too are left holding the baby and still wondering how the impact of this child will bring peace, justice, and a deeper love for a world right here and now. A world reeling from the atrocities of war, oppression, pain, injustice, and political, geographical, and religious division. But I believe this unfolding narrative in Luke's gospel today, portrayed through this tired old man named Simeon, is not only essential for the hope we proclaim during the Advent season and born on Christmas Day, but this narrative is also essential for the hope which propels us forward beyond the manger, beyond the birth. So before we travel too far from Bethlehem, we need to get a good grasp on the significance of this story, on the significance of God's promise fulfilled in a moment in time, on the significance of a promise fulfilled in the midst of humanity's brokenness, the significance of how we too are to live into a promise fulfilled, but not yet. Yes, Simeon spent his lifetime waiting and hoping and longing, even touching the light that would overcome the darkness. And the writer of Luke today invites us too to live into God's promises and experience the sweet release of peace found in the midst of suffering. This story today not only looks retrospectively, not just looks back at that long-awaited hope of God's faithfulness and the arrival of the Christ child, but this hope looks forward toward a future hope here and not yet. And I don't know about you, but for me, it's hard to live in the space between the birth of Jesus, between the beauty of the manger and the second coming of Christ. And as Christians, that is exactly what we are called to do. We are called to live in the middle and wait expectantly for hope, peace, joy, and love to be fulfilled. To let the wonder and the mystery still linger in our hearts. And oh boy, that's not easy. Keeping hope alive for me while watching tens of thousands of Palestinians die under the rubble of bombs is not easy. Keeping that hope alive while families and loved ones are still in captivity and the atrocities on October 7th are still fresh in the minds of those who survived. Keeping hope alive while the Ukrainian war has lingered and lives have been altered forever It's not easy. Or watch tens of thousands walk thousands of miles over rough terrain in hopes of a better future for their children is not easy. Waiting, and keeping hope alive is hard. Waiting for the fulfillment of God's promise of peace on earth and peace in our hearts is hard work. One of the prayer services I listened to from Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem last week was focused on hope. The pastor, Pastor Munther Isaac, was preaching to his congregation about hope. Hope in the midst of all that suffering for Palestinian Christians and for their Jewish friends. And I was amazed at how they somehow seemed to grasp this hope of now and not yet. They know as they look back at God's faithfulness and where it has carried them through heartache and tragedy thus far is the hope of the tomorrows that they seek. It is the not yet kind of hope. And it still lingers in that promise for peace for them and for their land and for a world in dire need of it. They still hope a vindication of a people who have been hostile and kept them living in occupation for years, and they still hang on to hope. You know, I long to know more about that kind of hope. I long to understand how they hang on to hope. I want to grasp that kind of hope for those who have lost ones to tragic deaths, to cyclic addiction, to suicide or senseless gun violence. I want to learn how to keep hope alive, the not yet kind of hope that has the ability to fill us with great joy in the midst of heartache. Hope for a world in need of a grand reversal, one that comes through the solidarity of God's love for his children. Through the eyes of the Christ child, you see, the writer of Luke's gospel places a great deal of importance on the type of freedom and the liberation which both Simeon and the prophet Anna are witness to, but not in the context of individual peace or of a long for heavenly home kind of peace, but rather for a divine agenda. An agenda which brings good news to the poor, good news to the marginalized, good news to those who have been left out due to the color of their skin, their gender identity, socioeconomic status, or simply their geographic location. Liberation and freedom. Good news to you and to me. And it dawned on me after the worship on Thursday. How did Simeon do it? How did he know? How did he wait and know that when the Christ child would be there? How did he know he was coming to the temple that day? The writer doesn't tell us that Simeon is a priest who would hang out there all the time. And I surmise this is the place where his hope stayed alive. You see, the hope this extraordinary baby brings to us is one found in community. It is found through you and me and throughout the body of Christ. A hope held and a hope shared. For Simeon and Anna, waiting and longing for the restoration of Israel would bring hope for all humanity, was not just this pivotal moment in time. You see, this child, this baby, who could have been born anywhere, in any number of ways which would have commanded attention, comes in light of an ordinary birth, but with extraordinary attentiveness to the cries of people everywhere who long for justice and peace. And along with this fulfillment of a lifetime of living in hope comes the not yet hope of the future and the uncertainty it brings. After this celebrated moment, we hear Simeon, after holding the baby, calling out to the mother, saying that this child, a sword will pierce your heart, for the thoughts of many will be revealed. And you know, that's not really what you would expect from a congratulatory or cordial greeting to a new mother. It's not what you would expect after a joyous occasion. It's not what you would expect after holding the Son of God. You know, sometimes our expectations are disrupted, and our longings go unfulfilled, and our hope wanes. And sometimes we want to know that with the coming of the Christ child, with the coming of enough money, with the coming of the right test result, with the coming of sobriety, with the coming of the right spouse or partner or relationship, with the coming of, that we will have lived into the fullness of the liberation of the baby. But thankfully, gratefully, we do not live under the law of our own expectations or those of others. We are not bound by their outcomes. Simeon wasn't, and neither are we. You see, God's not done yet. The good tidings of great joy are not done yet. Not for me, not for you, and not for all of creation. And that is the good news of an extraordinary birth. The hope of the tiny baby comes to humanity and lives, yes, lives in the midst of us in that waiting space. You know, sometimes I want to linger in the manger. I want to stay in that birth story where newness resides and hope is born. But that's not where we are called to stay. We are called to be active participants in this story. We are to live into the already hope and the not yet hope of the fulfillment of God's promises. The same hope, peace, joy, and love that ushered us into Advent is ushering us out, too. Out into a new year, but deeply, deeply impacted by the extraordinary hope of a baby. You know, Simeon got to hold the baby, and we do too. Amen.